All of this is an indication of how early things are at, right? If people are slapping in AI into a product, they're still trying to figure out where AI fits and trying a bunch of different things. Right now, it feels like you're editing something or manipulating something from a distance in not the highest fidelity way possible.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption, the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
Hi, I'm Yuhki Yamashita.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
Hello and welcome to today's show. Today we're going to dive into some controversial topics around AI in design. What's the future of design, and is everything just going to become an AI chatbot? And some existential questions about aesthetics, taste, and judgment. All with one of the best product managers, designers, and the chief product officer of the most important design tool in the world, Yuhki Yamashita. So stay tuned. All of that and much more on this week's show, right after the break.
Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance with SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's vanta.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Welcome back. Just before we jump in with Yuhki, we wanted to remind you all about the Startup Podcast Pact. If you listen to the Startup Podcast and get value from it, we ask you to help us spread the word by following us and reviewing us in your favorite listening app, subscribing to us on YouTube, and giving us a shout out on LinkedIn or wherever it is that you have your audience. It means the world to us. It helps more listeners find us and build their startups, and it allows us to keep doing what we're doing with amazing guests like Yuhki. So thanks so much. Now let's jump right in.
So a few other kind of related topics that you might be uniquely qualified to dig into with us, so maybe a little bit more controversial. We'll see. The first is, Figma's shipped a lot of great AI tools recently. I'm sure very much under your leadership and inspired by your direction. Where do you think this is all going? Where do you think, the intersection of AI and design is going? There's obviously designers who are very worried about their jobs. They're very worried about copyright. They're very worried about being disrupted and displaced. Where is the end state, or where is the next plateau here? Where is space for product designers in an increasingly generative AI world?
Well, I get two questions related to this intersection of design and AI. One is really about the future of designers. The second one is the future of interfaces. Is everything a chatbot kind of thing?
Oh, yeah, great. That's great.
Yeah. The first one on, what is the future of designers? It's for this reason that I like to take this broader definition of what a designer is. Will a designer's job change? I think so. They should leverage this technology to be able to work faster and maybe take them out of some execution details. And I think AI is just accelerating what's already been happening, which is kind of similar to what I talked about earlier, which is designers moving up the stack a little bit, where it's actually designers are no longer designing a button from scratch. In fact, they're not really pushing pixels in that sense anymore. They're assembling blocks that have already been coded. A lot of considerations have been made to put together experiences. And so they've already been kind of moving up the stack, and this accelerates some of that too. And there's a lot when you do a time lapse of product design, right? And you just screen record what people are doing in Figma. There's a lot of stuff in there that's just kind of rote manual labor, right? What does this look like when there's more content, or on Android versus iOS versus all these things that I actually think, bringing AI to help with that is appropriate and really great. And so two things happen. One is I actually think that, designers have the opportunity to focus on bigger problems, right? Or actual problems. They can go move up the stack, think about the strategy, think about these different user problems more. But then it also gives them the opportunity to explore more broadly and deeply. And that's really powerful because, in the past, you kind of had to say, oh, I only have so much time, so I'm only going to explore these options, or I'm only going to kind of talk about some of these solutions in this very gestural way because I don't have the opportunity to flesh it out. And maybe with the aid of the AI, you can actually flesh it out and get real reactions from people and get that kind of feedback. So I hope that, people look at that technology and say like, wow, this is actually going to like make you a way more effective designer. And at the end of the day, design, it goes back to what we said in the beginning, which is that like, it's about solving problems. And I actually think, A, problems don't go away. And B, now it just gets you faster, solving problems faster or finding better solutions. So that's my point of view, at least on the future of designers, where it's hard to believe that like there isn't a human in there, like representing the end user needs or thinking about curating this experience in a meaningful way, but not denying that some of what people do day to day has to change, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Yuhki.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think it's a really elegant way of describing it. And I have maybe even a slightly even more controversial question about this. And I wonder if the same way Figma participated in a fundamental disruption of client-side design tools, thanks to the sophistication of web browsers and the delivery of software through the web, I wonder if generative application development, potentially even on the fly, like an enterprise saying, hey, I'm just going to give you all my data and I want to generate productivity tools on the fly. If that's a potential end state where the machine can figure out the end user intent, or at least some line manager can, and they can just, a chat prompt go, I want a product that does A, B, C, D. And not only is there no need for a designer, potentially there's no need for Figma as we know it. There's no need for Xcode as we know it. Is that hyperbole? Is that exaggeration? Or is that just applicable to a certain slither of things? Like, is there a fundamental disruption on the horizon there, the same way Figma fundamentally disrupted, Sketch and Photoshop or something?
It's easy to look at Figma as a design tool and say, hey, it's for designers. But actually, internally and actually increasingly externally too, we've been thinking about what we're trying to enable is people building software faster, like better products, better software faster. That's why we've been focused on the developer persona. That's why we've been focused on the relationship between design and code. And so insofar as there's anything that disrupts that or helps people build better products faster, that is, potentially disruptive in an area that we want to be participating in or thinking about. That being said, when you think about kind of like, okay, well, can you just kind of like go to a working product with just a prompt? We don't think it's there. And maybe we can get there at some point, but like there's so much about a user experience that we have to give people some ability to express and control and manipulate. And maybe the ways in which you do that change dramatically or become much more accessible. But, like it feels hard for me to imagine that like you would be comfortable with allowing a machine to kind of figure out a lot of those details for you, because those are the very details that make your user feel one way or feel loyalty and stuff like that. So I definitely think that like there will be a proliferation of software just because from a prompt you can get something pretty reasonable out there. But I actually think when you think about how do you stand out in the sea of millions of apps that have been generated in that way? Well, it is through like these considerations around how does your brand get represented? Where are all the details that you've thought through, kind of like that level of control? I think that's where design is going to help.
Just very briefly, you've talked a couple of times, Yuhki, about designers moving up the stack. And, when we were talking about, the designing of a screen and so on, I can easily imagine that where AI can increasingly play is to take a low fidelity wireframe and turn it into a high fidelity screen. You can have AI that appropriately prompted and so on can figure out what metaphors to use, where the buttons should go, what size things should be, and everything like that. And so, in a sense, going back all the way to the beginning of our conversation, product designers become more and more pure on the design side of things, right? Not how it should look, but how it should work. And that means really understanding users, understanding human psychology, understanding a whole bunch of things like that. And then a lot of that more operational stuff, the more visual stuff, is the sort of thing that I could imagine AI taking more and more responsibility for.
That's absolutely right. And then I think Chris is also right in that, you still want to control that in, interesting ways beyond that. But yeah, you're right. I agree with that point of view.
You also touched, I think, brilliantly on this question of the chat bot, the chat interface and the future of design, because I've also got strong opinions about this. I do think chat is a suboptimal UX for many, many jobs, and users lack any kind of creativity in a lot of cases and need much more of a journey than that.
Well, I'll first talk about chat, which is, it totally makes sense why that interface is proliferated and has become like the first way in which AI is introduced to a lot of products, because it has two properties. One is it's really easy to just add that layer to your product. It doesn't disrupt your product in like a big way. It's just an overlay on top of your product. Like any product can accommodate that in their information architecture, right? So it's something that you can like easily layer on. And then more importantly, I actually think that it is an elegant interface that accommodates the limitations of today, which is, stuff like latency. Like it feels natural that like you text something in and then it's waiting and processing, and because it's like almost like a human being, and then like, something gets responded to. And so I think there's just like something about like the latency that exists today that like feels appropriate, whereas it would be frustrating in some other kind of like UIs potentially, depending on, or you need to get really much more creative about it. All of this is an indication of how early things are at, right? If people are slapping in AI into a product, they're still trying to figure out where AI fits and trying a bunch of different things. But, the reality is, I mean, even if you think about something like Figma, you're picking a particular color for a button, it would be really frustrating to do that through like text, right? Or you just want direct manipulation. And there's so many cases where like manipulating something more directly is going to feel so much better, so much more intuitive, and so much faster. So I think as we get more sophisticated and, kind of the interfaces catch up maybe to the AI and AI itself kind of changes, you're going to see more novel interfaces. And we're already beginning to see that, even with like some of the stuff Apple introduced, for example, or we're talking to a lot of customers who are thinking about it in novel ways. And so I don't know what that means in terms of like whether AI itself like changes the nature of interfaces, but certainly I would expect AI to be infused more natively into the product. So it feels more intuitive, more natural, as opposed to kind of right now, it feels like you're editing something or manipulating something from a distance in not the highest fidelity way possible.
Maybe as a designer, do you have any predictions perhaps for the direction of interfaces or the direction of design rather and products with AI integrated? Like, are there some metaphors or are there some ways of integrating that are more sophisticated than chatbots that you're starting to see take hold and that you believe will be successful?
Yeah, I don't know. My hot take is actually AI won't necessarily introduce new interfaces per se, and rather it'll make things just work in a way that was not possible before. And I think it's like the best example of like great experiences where you're not so loud about the interface or like the particular control. I think even when you look at the evolution of interfaces, initially you had to really rely on metaphors, to use your language, that feel familiar, rooted in the real world. And now people are so digital native. What holds more weight is not kind of how close it resembles some physical object in the world, but rather what is the most ergonomic thing? What is the most intuitive thing that you reach for? And I think that's the direction we have to go, right? Why kind of limit ourselves to these metaphors if the metaphors themselves introduce certain kinds of constraints that are unideal? So if you think about it that way, I think AI will do the same, where you're like, oh, I want to do this and I just want it to work. And, like it understands your intent a little better, or maybe the interface is more forgiving because it kind of understands what you're trying to do versus like really something that's rigid because it has to be kind of manipulated in a very specific way. I don't know. That's kind of my hope, but who knows?
I'm working with a startup that does like a property search portal, right? Like a Zillow. And we're doing this really neat thing with AI where we're just baking it into the standard UX. So we're offering AI price guides in a way that was not possible before. We're offering capital growth predictions that factor in neighborhood chatter, major developments and events, and other things that are harder to pull out of a database and to predict the AI things. And then that's just being expressed as a search query option and a results page and a new home profile, like an entity details page for the home. And there's no chat anywhere to be seen, right? It's just those little AI stars, right, that represent that AI has touched this like a fairy godmother, and to tell that story because everyone wants to see the AI story. But its AI is just baked into the data model. It's baked into the search query. It's baked into the normal UX. There's something to that, I think, that's going to be more popular.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think studying even the evolution of just search as the UI is itself indicative of where, other UI could go. I'm always surprised by when you talk to people who are maybe a generation younger than you, right? Like the way they do queries, like they just ask questions and it just works, right? Or like when you look at autocomplete, it works that way. Whereas in the before, like we would have had strategies for how to search things better. Or, we would know how to do stuff like define colon this, or, like the subtraction quotes, whatever. And like, now it's just like anyone can search, and it's just become more intuitive, and you don't need to know these hidden rules or how these controls work or anything like that. What does that look like for other kind of things outside of search is kind of the interesting question.
Yeah, so actually synthesizing all of these things, what it seems like to me is when we talked earlier on, Yuhki, about the fact that designers should come up with a vision for what's the ideal experience, unconstrained or relatively unconstrained by the limits of the technology, is this is a challenge to designers to be even less constrained, right? To not be thinking, oh, well, this crazy fantasy of how it should work is technically impossible. Because with AI, that's a challenge you should throw over to the engineers and say, this is what really good design would look like. Can we make it happen?
I think AI opens up a lot of opportunities for amazing experiences. It's kind of a fun time, actually, to be building products and designing products.
The last hot take we wanted to ask you about was, maybe it's a bit of an existential question. I think there's often a debate of like, do aesthetics matter? Is there such thing as taste and judgment? And is there things that are objectively better designed and people with better taste and judgment? Is it something you learn? Is it something you're born with? So this general discussion around like taste being subjective, aesthetics being subjective, these things being something maybe you're born with or you develop with experience. Where's your head at about all this stuff?
I have a particular point of view on this, and I don't know how well it's widely shared, but first of all, I think design is not art. And I think that distinction is really important, because art is where there's this notion of subjectivity, like people can assign a value to something. There's just a lot of irrational things that happen which cause you to be like, why is that, painting worth so much, right? But with design, I actually think there's more science in design than people think. And I think the science of a great product manager who works well with a designer is someone who can rationally explain why this is better, right? Like, Chris, you talked earlier about kind of like wizards and how they should work. And like, it should be pretty obvious that like, you need a clear CTA or, stuff like that, where, there's both a lot of science around it and just like rational reasons as to why. And so, I actually think that we did do ourselves a disservice by kind of likening design too much to art in that way. That's my first thing. Of course, there's like visual choices that you make that are going to be distinct and, like are more in the realm of brand identity. And that can be more about taste and subjectivity or stuff like that. But when I think about kind of like experiences and like what's good and what's not, I think a lot of it is very explainable. Like, you and I can look at a screen together, like decompose why it's like a good experience or bad experience given like the goals at hand.
Yeah, I think in my experience, the very best people, and I've flattered you a lot on today's show, but I think you are amongst the very best product designers and product managers in the world. I think take it for granted. I've worked a lot with people all around the world where it's obvious that they can't fast forward to a good answer or an answer worth testing or an answer that is justifiable, and their taste and their judgment isn't developed. Now, we could argue whether they're born with it or whether you're born with it or whether you develop it, or whether you can science your way to it with testing or with good patterns. But I do feel like there is a subset of people who fast forward to that answer, the better answer, the best answer, the most useful or effective answer more quickly. And I would describe that as taste or as judgment or as good aesthetics. And I do think that there is a subset of people who have that.
Okay, that makes sense. And maybe the nuance I would say is, I do think you're right that there are people who have great instincts and land on this better solution faster. And what I'm saying is that but every better solution can be rationally explained. That's where I want to be demystify the idea that that better solution itself is too subjective. So that's my point of view.
Yuhki, this has been just tons of fun, both very pragmatic and also kind of a bit philosophical and all expansive. Thank you for going on the journey with us. Obviously everyone should go race out and use Figma. And if you're not already, what the hell are you doing? You're living under a rock. But is there any other way they can follow your work, follow your thoughts, and follow you on the internet?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. Super fun. Not sure I'm like a huge social person, but here and there I drop stuff in LinkedIn, and I have a Figma community file where sometimes when I do my own designs, I post stuff there or my talks. So find me there. And I'm always really excited to hear kind of how people are using Figma, what feedback they have for us. So yeah, don't be shy.
Of course, we use it every week for our thumbnails and all our design stuff. And I've often said to people, if I didn't do my advisory work, I would just love to live in Figma all day as a designer. It's just my favorite thing to do. I've loved design my whole life, but Figma made it like a pure joy.
Hey, Chris, are Figma paying us to say all this stuff?
Absolutely not.
It's
Although,
free.
let's talk.
That's how cheap we are, folks. No, it's a fantastic tool. I love Figma as well.
Yeah, I mean, it is literally the gold standard for developing products. So, Yaniv, how can people find you on the internet?
I'm mostly on LinkedIn, trying to make it a little bit less boring, so you can find me. I'm the only Yaniv Bernstein on there, and I love getting connection requests from TSP listeners. So if you're a listener, just let me know in the request, and I'll accept it.
And of course, you can find me at chrissaad.com and on LinkedIn and all the social media at chrissaad. All right, guys, great conversation.
Thank you.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.